welcome to the Dare Academy. This is Dare Academy meets Lindsays, where I'm joined today with Kate Wyatt, a long-term supporter of the Dare Academy, and a first-timer, Alistair Smith, from the Lindsays team as well. So I've done my homework. I hope you don't mind me giving you some flattery to begin with and saying that Lindsays are a full-service law firm based in Scotland, with offices based in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and here in sunny Dundee, where I am. And their history stretches way back to 1815, which in my view is a solid indicator of a successful business. And we're delighted that you guys have agreed to be key sponsors for us again this year, which is the fourth consecutive competition that you've sponsored. So Kate is a partner in the business and employment and Kate is a partner and in the business and employment law sector for the company, and has vast experience in a range of employment issues, both from the employee and employer side of the law, working on many complex cases throughout her career, and has been a huge supporter of us. So we're really glad to have you back, Kate. And Alistair, you're a senior associate who has huge experience in corporate and commercial transactions, and pertinently to this competition, have done a lot in relation to startup and growing high technology companies, which I think is really cool for us in this competition. So welcome to you both. How are you?
I'm very well.
Alistair?
Really good, Scott. Really good.
I'll start with yourself, if you don't mind, Alistair. So this is your first time looking into the Dare Academy. You've checked out the trailers. What's your thoughts so far? What have you seen that you like?
Yeah, I've checked out the trailers. There's certainly a good diversity of games, and there's it's interesting to see new ideas and new people coming forward with these, and the way they've been expressed in the trailer videos is very informative of what people are doing and the sort of creative outputs that are coming from Abertay, which is really interesting and really good to be involved with.
And Kate, yourself, you've been with us for the last 4 years of the competition. Reflecting on your experience and missing out last year, what do you think's in store for us this year?
Huge change last year, and it's always brilliant to see the kind of levels of creativity. And I'm fairly easy to please, so I just love the graphics, but I don't sort of think through the complexity of everything that lies behind it. But like Alistair, looking at the trailers, you can see just the amazing ideas that are driving the gaming industry coming out of Dundee and Abertay. So it's great. Delighted to be back.
How's things been for you since the pandemic started? How has it changed the way that you guys work, and how has it changed you, do you think, to the advantage of potential startup companies, how they might work moving forward? If I start with yourself, Alistair.
Well, it's certainly changed the way that I've been working. It's been a change, but I think in a lot of ways it's been a positive change. There's been a lot more interaction, particularly with clients and with and businesses, and you see a lot more of your clients somehow through Zoom. Although you don't see them personally, you do see them a lot more through that medium. People seem to have almost forgotten the telephone exists sometimes, which is it's quite good to put names to faces, and I really quite enjoy that part of it. So that's good. I mean, I think from a sort of startup perspective or a fledgling business perspective, it's perhaps not quite so good because there's less, especially in the creative industries and the media industries, interactive tech and that type of things. It's perhaps not quite so good. There's not so much collaboration that can easily happen, and I know that's very much the case that coming out of a lot of industries, and certainly I'm hearing that from clients as well, that it's very difficult to collaborate when you're at the end of a computer, even in industries such as video games and technology, where you would think it was geared up for that type of interaction. In actual fact, people in studios like to be in the same place so they can bounce ideas off each other. And it's also similar in the legal industry as well, just to have someone to bounce something off. So it applies to all industries, I think, equally, but particularly in the video game sector, I think they really benefit from collaborating together. So hopefully with the move back to offices and workplaces, that might encourage more collaboration to come out.
And how about yourself, Kate? How's it been the last 18 months or so, and how has it changed the way you engage with clients? Is it similar to Alistair? Have you had things different?
Yeah, very similar to Alistair actually, and like Alistair, it's been great to almost have daily contact with some clients who are maybe further away, and so we wouldn't see in the office every day, and that's been a good thing. But I would very much echo what Alistair said, which is this sort of notion of a business culture, I think, has been harder to create and maintain. So certainly if you're a startup, driving and creating that culture at the start has been difficult, and that sort of ability to interact with each other and drive creativity, I think, has been tricky. But I think a really key point is that COVID and having to sort of crash into home working for so many businesses has created great opportunities for tech businesses, and for various ideas that have come about this as a result of these new ways of working. And actually, tech has made COVID better. If that's possible, tech has made COVID better, and it's allowed many businesses like ours to continue almost seamlessly. We would have been nowhere without Teams. It has saved our bacon in so many ways. And I think another thing, certainly in the employment sector, that's coming out of this is the opportunity to recruit talent from anywhere. And that I think is going to be a real change that's going to stay with us over the next couple of years, and something that I know the gaming industry tends to do already, certainly with some of the bigger studios, but I think that's going to drive further sort of global talent recruitment. And there are risks there that studios do need to be aware of, but that I think is a positive development by and large too.
I was going to ask you, Alistair, I know that you were a keen gamer, or you did reflect that you're a keen gamer back in the day. Can you give us your reflections on what kind of computer games you used to play when you were younger, or indeed if you do have time these days to get involved?
Well, sadly, I never seem to have time to do video games these days. I just seem to be so immersed in legal work, sadly. That's the sad thing. No, really, it's family life seems to take away the time. It's interesting how these things creep. But I mean, certainly I've played video games for a long time, played video games in my youth, the likes of Sonic the Hedgehog on the Game Gear, or the Pac-Man style games that used to exist as well, right through the likes of NHL hockey on the PlayStation, etc. at university, and onwards from there. So I guess those are the types of games that I've played in the past, as well as the usual. Those are the types of games I've played in the past.
Kate, I was just wondering about the games that you would have seen this year for the 6 who have made the final for the Dare Academy competition. Was there any of them that stood out for you, or anyone that you've got a keen eye on?
I think the key one for me is because I'm starved of holidays. It's just the opportunity to explore an island and restore balance. That just speaks to me so much. I'm desperate to get onto that game, get onto that island. But they're all great, and they're also different. And although maybe I'm not a big computer gamer, I think there are so many other applications of games. So this sort of gamification of problem solving, I think, has huge potential, and you can really see that in the games that are up this year, and in fact that have been up in previous years. There is that focus on how to do other things rather than just play, and that's brilliant from my perspective.
Alistair, I wanted to pick your brains about IP and infringement, because I know that's what you specialise in essentially. So there's a recent case with Capcom where an artist has alleged that several of their images had appeared in their games without their permission. So they've apparently provided proof of it. I've looked at the articles in question, so I do wonder, could Capcom be in a bit of hot bother here if they've used something without their permission, and what steps could they take, both the artist and Capcom, to make sure this sort of thing doesn't come to light?
I mean, I think the key in this area, and in the video game space as well as other creative industries, is not to copy someone else's idea or their image or whatever it happens to be. So in the Capcom cases that you mentioned, they've copied something that belongs to someone else. So it's not, that's just something that you shouldn't be doing. It's all about the expression of an idea. So for instance, if you set out in your video game and you want it to be a driving video game, for instance, you can perfectly well put in a red sports car. That's an idea you can put in your video game. But don't put in the image of a car with a prancing horse on the front, because that won't be good, and that will end you up in bother as a result of that. So I can see the issues here. Don't copy what other people have done. Don't copy their images. Don't copy their creativity. create your own creativity and put that in your game as opposed to copying someone else.
I'm thinking of a new game studio which we hope to see at the back of Data Academy 21. So a new game studio stumbled across something that's quite unique, or a piece of IP or a unique concept. How could you help them? What would be the steps that you take to help them introduce this into their practice?
So I guess my solution to the problem here is never lose control of what it is that's in your intellectual property jigsaw. So what's in your creative jigsaw? Never lose control of that. Ensure that it's all bound up in the package. Ensure that you have people under employment contracts whereby the intellectual property comes into the company. Ensure that you have people under good consultancy agreements if they're not employees, so the intellectual property again comes into the company. Or lastly, for instance, enter into a commercial arrangement with someone, so a license agreement or a collaboration agreement whereby you gather in intellectual property that forms part of your game and forms part of that overall jigsaw, that matrix of things that you need to put in your game. So from a game perspective, you've got software, you've got art, you've got music, and you've got interactive media. And it's the case of all these things coming together that makes the video game. So you must keep control of the intellectual property in all those items. And it's a difficult ask. It's not easy to do. So it's those things that are key to ensuring that.
What would Lindsays do? So what would you do as a corporate commercial lawyer to put these things in place?
I guess what we have expertise in doing is, so for instance, Kate can speak to the employment aspects clearly, and she puts in place employment agreements as well as policies, etc. for a company. We can deal with consultancy agreements, we deal with intellectual property licenses, everything from the licensing of an image, say for instance from a photograph, to dealing with an engine license whereby you input the software that you need to make your game work, or some middleware that you need to make your game work as well. So we can do all these things to make the game work and make sure that they bring in all the intellectual properties under these contracts.
Given that you deal with a lot of startups, what are the common mistakes that you see new studios making, and what pitfalls do they tend to go down, and what's your top tips, I suppose, to avoiding them?
I think in that space, it's very important that you make sure that employees don't bring intellectual property into your company from their past experiences. So they bring in something that actually belongs to someone else. And I quite often think that needs to be re-emphasized when you bring in a new employee. So that comes back also to the don't copy anyone else's IP aspects. So you need to do that. You need to put structures in place around that internally, and also I just guess creating the right culture internally to make that all work.
Kate, is there anything that I've discussed with Alistair there that yourself as an employment lawyer would get involved in? So just what you mentioned there, Alistair, about an employee bringing something into the company which is intellectual property that they have. Is there something you would put in place to combat any dispute in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we find is that at the start, when sort of startups are quite new and quite young, there's a sort of a feeling that it's irrelevant how you classify somebody, whether they're an employee, a consultant or a volunteer. And I think Alistair's flagged up really well that it's not irrelevant, because if somebody's an employee, by and large, the IP they create belongs to the business. If they're a consultant, there isn't that kind of presumption, so you do need proper written terms. And the other common mistake, I think, is thinking you don't need anything agreed and written down. If you don't agree it, there's still a contract, it's just not written, and therefore it's really hard to establish later what the terms are, and there's always going to be a disagreement about what was agreed. But I think Alistair also made a really good point there, which is about bringing in someone else's IP, and you can specifically provide for that in, for example, an independent consultancy agreement whereby you say you will not bring somebody else's IP, and you warrant that all the IP you're bringing to the party is IP you have the power to provide and that's yours to give. And if you've got that there, plus a proper clause on insurance or indemnity, etc., immediately the business is in a much better position and much less at risk. So it's all about taking some time at the start, being clear on who's what. And actually, I would say it's really worth the effort to have written terms of employment and a consultancy agreement. And so there's no problem at the end. If you're looking at the exit strategy 5-10 years down the line, nobody's going to come in and say we're interested in the business, but there's a big hiccup because we don't know that you own all this IP. And we're not clear on who does own it. So that's the thing. It's about getting it right at the start, I think.
Brilliant. And what's the best way to do that, really? So a startup company who are thinking, I've got a great idea, they then think, right, we're ready to go with this. Would the advice be go and speak to people who can sort out all the contractual issues at the very beginning?
I think we'd always suggest that, as you'd expect. But I think it's, what we do say at Lindsays is we're not going to give you what you don't need. So if you want a light touch, we'll do a light touch, but you have to understand what the risks of light touch are. And startups haven't got the money to spend a fortune on contracts and so on and so forth. So we do offer a startup package, which is very modestly priced and can be just right for that early stage. But I think it's really important then to review. So as the business grows, what it needs, what works for it is going to change, and also relationships change. So somebody may have started as an independent contractor, self-employed, and then become an employee. So you need to reflect that. So do take advice at the start, but make sure it's appropriate for your size and stage, but then keep taking regular advice as you go through. And just getting it right at the start is going to be so helpful if things get complicated later on.
Kate, given your experience as an employment lawyer, I'd like to ask you about crunch culture in the gaming industry. And I read a quote earlier on when I was researching in advance of this interview, and this is from Business Insider, which says, playing video games is delightful. The business of making video games can be another story altogether. So now crunching is essentially where those creating games are occasionally or often required to work long hours to meet certain deadlines in time. So that can often result in essentially unpaid overtime. So what's your views on crunch culture and how does it stack up in the law in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. And I think this comes back to conversations that I've been having with game studios for many years now, which is a sort of a restriction versus retention sort of approach. And many games companies prefer to take a retention approach to their staff rather than trying to tie them into post-termination restrictions, etc. And if you're looking to retain good and scarce employees in this environment, you're going to have to treat them well. And that's creating a positive working environment. And this kind of crunch working, I think, really affects how they're going to manage to retain good staff and adversely affect their ability to do that. So I think it's all about being transparent on hours and expectations. And actually, there are some specific legal points here. So unless staff are actually quite highly paid, if you're asking them to work 100-hour week, you're probably not paying the minimum wage. You're probably not providing them with their appropriate daily and weekly rest, and you're going to get yourself in bother and find that you've got some regulatory authorities knocking on your door potentially and looking into those points. So, it is worth making sure you're thinking that through. Now, there are exceptions under the working time regulations where people who are in industries that have this sort of sudden rush on can ask staff to work longer hours. But then if you're doing that, you have to be fair in return. So you have to offer time off in lieu. You have to offer compensatory rest. And you really should be looking at whether what you're paying is appropriate in light of that kind of working time. I did notice as well that along with the sort of the publicity given to crunch working, there's a sort of a suggestion that there's a bit of a bullying environment in computer gaming. And again, allowing that kind of culture to take hold isn't going to contribute to retention and therefore the long-term success of your business. So it's really important, I think, to create a fair, considerate environment and just do everything that you can to achieve that.
That's really insightful. I did wonder, just given the nature, because it seems to be quite a common thing that this just happens in this sector, and it made me think: is this any dissimilar from what a chef would have in terms of they maybe go into the kitchen early doors first thing to prep and then have a lunch service? I know that that's quite close to crunch and lunch. That's a terrible joke. I don't know if that'll stay in this, but and then they obviously have dinner as well and brunch if they need to. But the idea is that they could quite conceivably be doing long hours too. So is there an argument to say that this is just how this industry is, or is that irrelevant against the law?
No, there really is, and you're right. And as I say, there are sort of exceptions set out in the applicable legislation to allow for industries like tourism, catering, etc., where there is a seasonal surge in work to sort of flex the hours and flex the rules under the working time regulations. But I think pointing to the hospitality industry is really timely, because between a combination of COVID and losing staff who've been fed up with being furloughed, and Brexit and losing a sort of a rich seam of EU workers, there is a real shortage of chefs. Organisations are really struggling to recruit chefs, and therefore if they want to recruit and they want to retain, they're going to have to up their game in terms of the benefits that they offer, in terms of the way they manage this long working hours culture. And I think the same potentially applies to gaming and to the creative industries as well. If you're going to expect a lot, you have to counterbalance with good working environments, in other terms.
Is there anything you would add to that, Alistair?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that you can do for staff that don't necessarily involve just paying them more money. For instance, you can set up your company in such a way as you could offer them options. Now, it's not something that you would necessarily be doing straight away, but you could set your company up so you could offer them options in terms of shares. So it would effectively give the staff member a percentage of the company when it came to actually exiting by either a sale to someone else or just working the game that results. So these are other incentivization options other than just paying your staff more money, which may also have other benefits in times when times are tough and you need to get to the deadline. You need to push that deadline, but we're actually going to offer you a certain percentage of the company as a result for all your hard work and effort that you're putting in now. And yes, we can't pay you more just now, but we're going to pay you more in the future. These are certainly things that need to be considered at a relatively early stage, not immediately perhaps at the startup stage, but there are lots of tax beneficial schemes that the government offer for startups to offer options to staff that do help incentivize, particularly in periods such as crunch as you refer to.
The other thing is, I think that's a really good point made by Alistair, which is that not all benefits are financial. And so a key thing that we've seen emerge from COVID is flexibility. So the ability to work from home when you need to, the ability to be in the game studio, etc., when you want to, but also flexibility over hours. So a sort of a movable feast in terms of your core hours and when you do and don't work. So there are all sorts of options. And I think we are seeing a much broader menu, sticking with your lunch theme, Scott, a much broader menu in terms of benefits and how we make it work and make it attractive for good employees. So
disputes in new organisations is something that I thought would tackle or tie both your expertise in, if you like. So there is, of course, a natural thing where people, start a new company or a new partnership. There's a lot of enthusiasm, and for various reasons, they might fall out, they might agree to move on different ways, and there might be a lot of animosity at times. So in terms of a new startup company, and if and when this does happen, what should companies, or what should they do as individuals or as a company do to negate any long-standing negativity for this? What could they do working on both sides of your law?
I would say, first of all, get it right at the start. If you're clear on who's an employee, who's a contractor, who's a volunteer, etc., and you put in place clear written agreements fit for purpose, that's going to really minimise the risk of problems later on in terms of who owns IP and so on and so forth, and understand what the exit arrangements are going to look like. Alistair, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Kate. I think you do need to be clear on what everyone's relationship is with the company. Who owns the company, for instance, which I appreciate may sound like something that should easily be ascertainable, but it's all very well putting in place just ownership on Companies House. So if you have a 3-person company, everyone owns 33% of the company. But if you just set that up at Companies House and just set that up in that way, that doesn't give you a lot. The law doesn't give you a lot to go on in terms of if you have a dispute with these people in the future. What you need really at that stage is a shareholders agreement or an agreement amongst yourselves as to how you're going to work things out if things don't go as planned. Now, when I say things don't go as planned, things may go as one or two of the individuals planned, but not the third person, and therefore they can no longer continue, but you need to put in place something to deal with that, and preferably dealing with it at the earliest possible stage when all your interests are aligned in terms of a shareholders agreement, and putting that in place. And that's certainly something that we can help you with in terms of structuring your business at the earliest possible stage. And I think I've said this a few times in this interview. Do everything as soon as possible to avoid disputes. Put in place your contracts in relation to your IP at the earliest possible opportunity. Put in place your contracts in relation to your shareholders and making sure everyone's invested in the same direction. And that way it makes a lot simpler and easier to sort out disputes. There is nothing worse than coming to the situation where the relationship has effectively ended and then trying to sort it out without anything to rely on and go back on.
I was going to pick up with yourself, Kate, given that, again, we're speaking about startup companies and namely the Dairy Academy competition. One of the key avenues they will use to promote themselves and promote their games as they move forward will be social media. So social media plays a huge part of promotion. A lot of game companies often use Twitch for streaming. How dangerous an environment can social media mismanagement be for an employer and indeed an employee, and how can they get it right?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Scott, and one we've talked about in the past. So as you say, it can be a great way to promote the business, raise profile, and also communicate with your customers. But I think from a business perspective, it's important that the business controls its use, because the business can be liable for an employee's misuse, and there can also be, as a result, negative publicity from inappropriate postings. And I think that's something that we're all familiar with. We've all seen these sort of negative postings which have resulted in a sort of a media storm. So I think it's helpful to say maybe these are the employees who are going to post on behalf of the company, and to be clear with them what they can and can't post. So you need to distinguish between when employees are posting in their personal capacity, and if you're doing that, think about asking them to put disclaimers on which says these are my personal views and they're not the views of the organisation, as opposed to posting for the business, and try to keep that within a relatively controlled group. Now, that may not work for every organisation, and there may be some that have a much freer and easier approach to it, but that is the way really to minimise the risks of issues there. And it can also be helpful to have a social media policy, and even providing some training on social media use to staff. But at the very least, I think look for some guidelines, and those guidelines should be covering things like preventing disclosure of IP, because you don't want to be prejudicing your IP protection by putting it out there before it's properly protected, protecting your confidential business, but also protecting any third-party information that you're handling, because that can get you in bother under the GDPR or Data Protection Act. And be clear with employees that if they don't get the social media right, there could be consequences for them, because I think that will help them to understand that it's not just a bit of a game, etc. I mean, you'd be amazed how many employees think it's okay to go online and say about something produced by their employer, this is rubbish. And I'm paraphrasing when I say rubbish, and think it's not going to be spotted, because of course it is spotted. It does get picked up, and that does have consequences. And even if an employee is online in a personal capacity and posting views that are unpalatable or unacceptable to their employer, there is the possibility that that will have a negative impact on the employer's image. So, for example, if you are a games studio that really prides itself on your approach to equality, and you have somebody who is posting in a personal capacity views that are utterly antithetic to that ethos, that could be something that may justify disciplinary action. But you're going to need, as an organisation, to have a good, clear policy in place that says what you accept and what you don't accept. So you're absolutely right, Scott. Even personal postings can have an impact on employment and on the business.
I think that essentially wraps up our conversation of all the things I would like to tackle with you today, given that your level of expertise and the stuff that you've shared with us this afternoon is really insightful. So I'd like to thank you both for your time this afternoon, and we look forward to working with you throughout the hot housing experience here at Dairy Academy, and indeed moving into the final and beyond. So thanks again for your tremendous support to the competition, and we're really looking forward to the summer.
Thanks, Scott. Great to be involved.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and really looking forward to working with the teams through the summer. So.